Thank you all for being here. I'm sure you are all, as I am, a huge fan of Katharina's work. So should we get right into it? So as Soraya was glossing there, this is an exhibition that brings together new paintings from your studio in New Zealand, which is, I understand, it's a place of solitary creation often. Works from your archives, and this very recent, made very, very recently indeed, in situ work, which you see in the gallery space over here. And while we could think of this perhaps as some form of retrospective, it's not hung chronologically. And indeed, I've been kind of thinking in the way it mixes up works from these three strands in among each other. And it made me think of this wonderful moment in Nabokov's memoir, Speak Memory, where he talks about his life as a magic carpet. And in writing his memoir, he's folding it up so different parts of the pattern are superimposed upon each other. And visitors into the kind of house of his life that he's evoking through words might trip on this carpet. So, I mean, this made me think about your practice and how time operates within it. Both in terms of this show and how you've organized this show. It'd be wonderful if you could speak to that, but also how time operates within the works themselves. And so over to you, please.
Yeah, this is not going to be like a, what an intro, like a 2-hour monologue on. No, but I mean, time is such an interesting, we all know, right? It fleets, we can measure it. It is an ingredient of our everyday process. And yeah, it was an amazing chance for me to do this show, because it's for the first time ever that I can bring together these different perspectives and sections of my practice in one show. So there is the youngest work, which is really painted here, just like a couple of days ago. It's young. And then there are works that are maybe 3 or 4 months old, coming from New Zealand, from a totally different time zone, from where it is now night. And then there are the works that are going backwards up to 2004. And they are all brought together into this moment for us together, and they are starting to relate to one another as if there is no relationship to when they were made. Because the interesting thing about a painting is that they do not have a beginning and an end. They are clusters. They are in it themselves not a medium that has a consequential, consecutive logic. They defy that kind of logic. They don't live within the logic of time as we know it. And that is something that I started to understand as super interesting for me, and that's why I became a painter. Because you develop a different thinking when you're painting. You're starting to see things as constantly interrelated. So I was not able very early on in my life to see a flower vase that is different from the table. I tried to paint it, and it was not really working so well. But it took me a long time to understand that I see the whole. I always see the amalgamation. And within the process of making a work, or within the process of selecting the different works, time changes in its quality as well. So when I do this work here in the gallery, just left to us, and I paint there, and I know I have 4 or 5 days, and there are people that have 4 or 5 days that help me. That is a material. That is not something that I can defy. So I sit within that as we sit on this podium. It is almost an objective that enters my system. But within that kind of process, the time expands. And I can, because I'm in that very moment when I painted, get rid of that notion of organization. And within that notion of being right in the moment, I project already into the next project that I want to do with what I'm experiencing right now, So you're constantly having all the different qualities of time at your fingertips. It's not that there is one thought or another thought, but they're all at the same time available. And it really depends on what I want to do or what I want to develop in my structure, or with other people, or in relationship to other areas in the world where the projects are going to be envisioned.
Yes.
these these little bubbles expand or contract or become more concrete, more focused, more measurable, or they fall completely apart.
Okay, that's wonderful. I'm interested, you were talking about while you're working on a particular piece, so you gave the example of the in situ work here, the seeds or some of the energies of future works will be germinating or sparking. Do you feel that some of the newer works here kind of speak back to the kind of archival works on display in this show?
Yeah, that was another really interesting and new experience for me. I did start the conversation, or I was invited by Jay to come here to have a thought, and that was all of a sudden an amazing platform to develop a structure, what would I want to show, and would I want to show maybe older works, and I got very inspired by these conversations, then later with Soraya and with Johannes, and we built models, and it started to form that there would be a core show of very large works that came from the last years, and almost like acupuncture needles of different methods in my work. And they started to develop almost a spider web, and not a chronological order, as you say, right? So, and that is also something that is very, in my thinking, I don't think of chronology a lot. So when I also go to Venice very soon, for example, I would love to go and have time to go to the Scuola di San Rocco, because that is really, really important for me. I draw a lot of information from there. I almost bring it into the present tense. And this spiderweb structure that we discovered in our model made me rethink my work in the studio, and I almost started to work precisely for this occasion. So it is also the first time that I took into account so much older structures into my studio work.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'd like to take you to the title of the show. I Set Out, I Walked Fast, which I believe is from Jane Eyre, Charlotte Bronte's novel Jane Eyre. Can you tell me how you arrived at this title?
Yeah, so I'm reading sometimes here and there, not very organized, but I plucked the book out of the bookshelf sitting on my little cliff in New Zealand, and it's a really wild, there are lots of elements very prominent, so it's rocky, when it rains it pours, the sun is strong, the winds can be extreme. We have really, really stormy nights where we have lost doors and windows in the house, and it's remote. It's off the grid, solar panels and water tanks. So I was sitting there a little bit after painting and reading this book that had such an urgency. This person setting out, doing things, finding her decisions, not losing time, not having a lot of options actually, but within that very parameter she has, she almost cuts through the conventions, the offers that she gets by well-meaning people. And I thought it was the independence and the directness and the ability to act, think, and do things all together in one go. I felt very much relating to how I work. When I have these large canvases, I don't go and have a little sketch and then I transform it into a larger painting. It is all right away in the right in that kind of zone of the painting that I make the work.
Yeah, there's something looking at the in situ work, the sort of energies that flare out from the bronze sculptures seem very, very much those energies of Jane Eyre kind of setting out with full of intention that may or may not kind of go awry.
And it's also a feminine heroine,
Yes.
I mean, she is getting a lot of offers later on in her, and it's very entertaining, that's the other thing. It's an amazing book full of images with even little things like how she comes home and the moon is up, or she doesn't know where to sleep and she finds a little hole in a hedge and nestles into that hedge and sits there somehow overnight. Or there's a lot of very interesting transformation. There are a lot of transformation that they all shift what I know from how I live in my structured almost, even though I travel a lot and so on. But I think it is very interesting. And it's only minimal differences. So there is the stars and the moon in New Zealand are very, very important where we live. We can see it really well. And I've started to travel to places that have dark skies a lot in the past years. And I've spent a lot to look at such stars, but without, you know, I'm not going, this is now Uranus or something.
Okay,
but
so it's not a
no, but I've
categorization.
but I've been looking into, so I went to places that have very special telescopes, and I was looking more and more into things that can't be seen with a normal eye, and it is, I mean, it's a big fantasy as well, but it is fantastic. So you see these nebulae that are thousands of millions of years old.
Wow, yeah.
And maybe they are not there at all, you know. But this idea of sitting on that little ball, almost at the edge of Milky Way, is a fantastic way to expand the scale of my tiny little speck, you know. So I enjoy that.
And I was wondering with this title, I mean, the I here is quite ambiguous. The I set out, I walked fast. Whether this is you, whether it's Jane Eyre, whether it's any of us as a visitor to this exhibition, whether it's a kind of collective I, perhaps. I mean, I don't know if you have thoughts on this.
Yeah, I didn't think about it in that very specific way, but it's a very active title. It's a tool. It's something you can use as a compass needle almost. If you say it, I set out, I walked fast, you already voice an intention, and you don't only read the title, so you instrumentalize yourself, if you will, in purpose for the show. But you also say the I, so the I that is reading the title is becoming the I of Jane Eyre, is becoming the I of me choosing the title.
Yes.
So it's almost like an image within an image with an image of an I, and that was a reason why I thought it was interesting.
Great, thank you. I'm thinking about your work, and thinking especially about some of the large-scale in situ works, and I should probably have a sidebar here that we're using that phrase advisedly, and that site-specific is not a term that you're interested in, even if we're looking at projects like Rockaway, or in the Rockaway Peninsula in New York, or indeed a work like Cloud at the Basel Messerplatz, which you made last year, is extraordinary, across this public square in the conference district. I mean, actually, before I get to what I'm going to say, I'd love you to speak to us about that distinction between in situ and site-specific, which I think would be very helpful.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's more like a theoretical question, I guess. And as you all know, I'm not a theoretician. So, but I'm not working in the idea of the site-specific as, let's say, a Michael Escher piece would operate. So I'm really not interested in very specific how would I say that best?
So perhaps the histories of a place, or the...
Yeah, that's exactly.
Yeah.
I didn't find the words. But the thing is that I, of course, resonate very strongly with the space and the site and the relationship I have to it, and also everybody else has to me that is coming with the location. That is that's for sure, but I see it more as an image, you know. I don't really see it as a, as a agglomeration of facts. I see it as almost as a fantasy. And that is what I use to respond to. And then, I mean, we just see it there, the Rockaway's piece, there is a lot of history in it. But I also zoom out and I see it more as a place that is in between land and water, which is a border. And that border is very often a notion of utmost drama,
Yes.
theatricality, condensation of emotions, negotiation between two different interests, water and land, are not the same, right? And it looks different according to where you come from, or whether you go out or you come in. It might be a holiday resort, or you might come from another place where you are trying to be on exile, you know. So I think I have a different emotional notion to the situation, but it is definitely very important where it is. But it is not coming from the idea that is right away tied to an institutional program.
Got you. Wonderful. It's interesting you use the word image there. And I mean, thinking about your work, for me, one of the things that strikes me is a lot of the everyday language I might use, or even kind of perhaps some more kind of specialist language as an art historian or an art critic or a curator, feels a little inadequate to, you know, when I think of your paintings, especially the large-scale paintings such as Rockaway, for example, image doesn't quite seem to sufficient to describe that situation. I mean, images for me kind of feel bounded and somehow kind of set aside from everyday life. And I'm kind of wondering how you feel about, you know, this kind of terminology, or whether, you know, what you're doing is trying to take us somewhere we haven't been before, in terms of where paint lands, how paint exists in the world, whether it's not so much image as perhaps sort of energetic field or event even.
Yeah, I think all of these things would be desirable. Energetic fields and something that we haven't seen before, that I go places I haven't been before when I work. But I mean, at the beginning when I was starting to understand I wanted to be a painter, I really thought it was very attractive, that a painting is not like what I experience as a functional given.
Yes.
That it has that ability to open up a membrane between imagination and a certain degree of reality that we would negotiate between the two of us without being too complicated.
Yes,
right?
yes.
But when painting actually, or when I started to understand where my ability to paint would lead me to, I understood that it had a very, very strong relationship to my whole system.
Right.
So it's not only the little scribble there on the paper, but that scribble would lead into here, into the whole thing.
Yes.
So the whole thing was actually wriggling. It was not just the finger. So I understood my whole body was constantly involved. And so was my walking and my looking, and my eyes were going here, but I was painting there. So I started to see that it's far more interconnected, what I was interested in painting. And yet I would produce an image, or I would use the elements of painting an image, if you will, that has to do with breaking through a glass of... there is a great moment in Jane Eyre where she is very young and she lives with a family that doesn't like her very much, and she wants to withdraw, and she takes up a book, and she takes that book and wants to read it without being disturbed, and she goes on a windowsill and pulls the curtain away, and there's the window and the curtain, and she's in between that zone, and that's where she starts to read.
That's lovely.
And he looks out of the window and sees in the dark the garden, which is already a first projection almost, right?
Yes.
And this kind of degree from going to take something, take it somewhere else, transform it by that little shift into another experience, that is actually what I use painting almost, I use it almost as a transmitter to get us into that area. And that's why I use these different areas of painting as well, like the very large, expensive ones that resonate and constantly bounce off the like here, the glasses of the Messeplatz or other people walking on it, or that have a reaction with it. And I also go into the studio where I have a completely different relationship to the painted image, where I can use my experiences from there and put them into a very intimate, unobserved zone where I can test it, I can paint over it over a longer period of time. And therefore, I think, I think painting is a really large thing, and I just take a bite out here, a bite out there. And Yeah, and it is certainly the energy that I'm fascinated with. The first impact it has on your body system, the being awakened almost in a way by being shifted and finding another form of insight, of understanding, of wonder about something.
Yeah. I love that you took that moment from Jane Eyre, because of course her image, by the glass, will be cast onto the contours of the physical world there. That's very, very interesting, I think. Is it useful to think of your work as abstract painting?
Yeah, well, depending on what you want to do.
Yes.
If you want to tell somebody what I do,
Yes.
who understands what that might be, that could be a very good way to communicate. You see, I'm not interested in terminology as such. I'm actually almost anti-terminological, anti-logical, if you will. I mean, I like the paradox. I like exactly that friction that comes about by negotiating things that are not to be negotiated so easily.
Yes.
So I think the notion abstract is historically saying that something is cut off the world, cut off the everyday.
Yes.
And that is certainly not the case in my case.
And to some degree a closed system as well.
Yeah, that's exactly true. Thank you. That is something that I'm very fascinated by, that the open work, the open painting that has inlets for other things to be projected into, that is a notion that I really like. The idea of the finished work is a thought that I don't nourish, because my process is so important. So in my studio I have always a lot of works where I work at the same time, and so plucking one out is not necessarily because it's finished, but it's because it shows something that I find that could lead me to another step. So very often there are paintings that lead to more options and yet to more options, and then it is a matter of coming together, and that's why the curatorial work is so important, and working with other people. And for example, this gallery together is also to selection, to edit, and to find out together what for this very moment would be a good, would be a really interesting thing to show. What could it contribute to our discussion in painting, and where are we with that, and why do we need it?
I mean, I think that's very interesting. The exhibition as a kind of technology, I suppose, or as a tool, is always a kind of temporary constellation of ideas. I mean, it gets dispersed, at the end of the exhibition's run. But I think really kind of leaning into that aspect of it and kind of thinking through that's a really, really fascinating thing. I've noticed. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was interrupting you, right? But I like the idea of disperse, because that is something that happens constantly. I mean, there are amazing collections right now being out for auction where you go, oh my God, that is such a pity. This private collection is now going to be dispersed, But that is almost like an ability for the next generation to take all these elements and put them together in a new way. And that is also something that happened to me with this show, that I was able to put my work together in a new way, in a way that I hadn't seen it before. And that is invaluable, because these large paintings, you can imagine, I don't have them all the time out to have a look at them, and that is really, really interesting to not even as a moment of look what's all happened, like I don't know how you say that in English, but that you understand, okay, where am I now? That's not even that. It's more like a game, like a play, it's material to me. The paintings have become truly a material to me, as is the painting itself in the studio. So there are different degrees of almost manifestations of your work, I think, that can happen. So the idea of the survey is not it's not even defining a canon-like status of your work, but it's more like a really refreshing and new way to see things be meaningful to yourself.
Wonderful. I've noticed in a few places, in a few interviews I've read and so on, you mention early exposure to experimental theatre as something that's in one way or another, fed into your thinking about how you work as an artist. I mean, I'm imagining this is not about performance, because this is not performative work in any sense. And I was wondering if it's more about the breaking down in experimental theatre between, well, what we have here, between the audience and the stage. And when we go into this in situ work here, we're walking on the surface of the image of the painting. Can you speak to that, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, it makes me almost feel this is inappropriate that we're sitting on the stage and not formed a little oval. Yeah, no, my family was very much into theater, and since I was a little kid, we would go see plays for adults, Whether that is even appropriate nowadays to say that, I don't know, but I saw Shakespeare early on and stuff. And it was really, really inspiring, because as a little, like 6-year-old, it's amazing to see somebody cut some flesh out of their breast so as to get the daughter back or something.
Yes.
I was really like, oh my God, this is magic. But then I think... so very influential were these hybrid versions of, like, for example, my generation, so it was Pina Bausch. That was the dance theater, where you saw all these crossovers between speaking, dancing, singing, clusters of people performing together, formations of abstract movement, for example, and so on and so forth. And that was really interesting. So there was no standardized understanding of performance in that. That I think was probably very important to see. But of course, I'm not a performer. That is very important to say. And
absolutely.
I think my understanding of also that a painting could appear anywhere in our everyday life.
Yeah.
As a dance movement could, or somebody is singing a song on the other side of the garden wall, which is very enchanting.
Yeah.
So this is also, that is almost like a dream or a wish to have all these things occur in our life. And that's why I started to see, when I lived in Italy, that they have a very natural relationship to an image all of a sudden at the corner of a little house, or then even in functional images in monasteries or churches and so on. And this thought of putting this out in a larger scale as a painter, that was coming from all these encounters.
I mean, another thing that's occurred to me is, clearly your work, your practice, points to all sorts of possibilities for painting that haven't been considered before. At the same time, it also, I feel, looks back to some of the very earliest paintings humanity's ever made. So I'm thinking, in the medieval period, fresco painting, where the image and the architecture is one and the same in lots of senses, and then even more profoundly Aboriginal rock art, or Upper Paleolithic artists working in Lascaux or Altamira. Is this something that's kind of occurred to you? This deep sense, this deep connection to very ancient ways of painting that have nothing to do with the illusionistic quality of the flat rectangular support?
The illusionistic quality of the flat
or the illusion. Well, it could be illusionistic, or it could be
could be anything.
It could be anything. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Let's say the flat rectangular support.
I think that is so fascinating, because that flat support or the white walls, that's a relatively new idea.
Yeah.
So we had colored walls, or some sort of brocade, silk coverage, or tapestry, or we had walls that were actually carrying some sort of pictorial quality for most of the time that we lived, I guess. Not that I can speak of direct experience. No, but I think certainly that is nothing that I had early on, but I discovered it more and more the more I work. Like, I can remember I did the Biennale in Sydney in 2000, and we were then invited to go up north to Darwin and to Kakadu, where there are a lot of rock paintings.
Yeah.
And so we were swimming a little water hole towards a rock, and our guide said, "And now look up." We were, and there was a hand, a negative hand that was sprayed on the rock, and that we have seen that in images a lot, and it's very famous. But this is my spray technique, or not my, but a spray technique, and it's also the stencil. It's the touch of the world that is covering the world.
Yes.
And excluding something that I can't see anymore, you know. And that is exactly what I do in my work. So this rectangular format you were talking about, right, is only a location almost, you know. It's not, and that's something that I started to understand far more in these paintings here I did in New Zealand. So it's not a picture plane that is then gathering illusionistic make-believe or envisioning, make thought out compositions, but it is more like a location which I manipulate into smaller or larger surfaces while I work. So I exclude or I cut off or I cover certain things and work only on this here or and then only on that there. Or the hand is, you know, it's exactly the same that our ancestors at some point did. And when I do that, I do have sometimes that feeling of drilling right through into the hand of that origin.
Amazing.
And that is fun, and that is something that everybody can would have. Or like, for example, what you were saying about the color, the directness of the color. I could go to medieval paintings and see these amazing oranges and reds and blues in the ornaments of the church people, you know, that are so strong and glowing from within. It's not just our invention of the neon light that makes us see something artificial and strong and almost, how would we call it, industrial.
Yes, yes. And otherworldly to some degree as well. Yeah. I'm interested in paint as a material to work with. And
we have something in common.
And your...
That's good.
Yeah.
Let's go on.
Because I mean, when I work with words, or I work with works of art that sort of pre-exist. I work with something that is about selecting and then putting together, a particular kind of mode of composition. And I think a painter works with infinitely malleable substance and infinitely malleable material. And I was kind of wondering your thoughts around that, the kind of freedoms that involves that are perhaps sort of extra linguistic, the kind of how one thinks with paint, if that makes any sense, and whether you could speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, your question seems to think or propose that thinking is language-based. No.
No, I mean, perhaps I...
or is that what you are experiencing?
I mean, I kind of hope that's my experience, but I'm hoping that there are other ways of thinking.
Yeah, there must be, because otherwise there wouldn't be painters, for example. Or my painting is exactly true. I mean, thank you for... and that is something I've been struggling with a lot, at the beginning of my life as an artist. Because I come from a background, I would read a lot, learn languages as a kid, and as I painted my first painting, it was a real light bulb thing when I thought, that is not, I haven't been talking for 2 hours, my body was feeling different. I can put in things that are behind me, I can organize my vision. I don't have to think, I don't have to stick to something that is, in a sense, true. I don't have to argue, because language and debate and back and forth and that fell away, and I was starting to come to this experience of falling in love as well. When the debate is stopping, when you're experiencing some sort of fusing. All the elements into an experience that is neither logic nor unknown, nor is it's so familiar, but it's not known, maybe.
Yes.
Let's just imagine we fall in love with one another, for example, yes, right?
Sure.
We've just met. No, but I think that is a very deep experience. It can happen with a lot of things, and that is exactly the state you're in when you are when you've left your intention. Your intention propels you forward. You have your set of rules. You start out with the rules.
Yes.
They're almost like a handrail. And then it falls apart, and you are being in a real interesting conversation. You're constantly checking. It's not that you're starting to get into la la land, right? You're
Yes.
constantly checking in a state of either you're completely in love or drunk. I saw a really interesting interview with Isabelle Huppert the other day, and she said, when you play, you're almost, you're clairvoyant, you know.
Okay.
So but you are not following a director's advice. Because otherwise that would be stupid. You know, you want to do something you have not. So you do something that you've never done, and you do it as if you know you have to do it. And that is that kind of that is that kind of state you're in when you're doing the work. And I like to work with that state, is especially pre-lingual.
Yes.
Because of my background, you know, where you are. I don't quote. I don't have imagery that I use. So the core of my work, the soul of my work, is really the color that has so many different facets. It can do so many different things. It can carry emotions. It can denominate certain items, but it is without sight. It is completely stripped off a function.
Yes.
It doesn't need a bone structure. We've left behind the idea that drawing is the vessel that has to be filled with color. That's gone, that idea.
I mean, color here creates form in these works, right?
Yeah, even the notion of form would not be fruitful for the next steps, I guess.
Because I guess form dissolves and dissipates.
No, there is some sort of strategy, and there's an operative mind, which is very often mine. I believe
very
at
often
least.
yours.
Yeah, but we build new cloud movement. I mean, we build a brain here together, I guess. Or, I don't know. But I mean, we. Look, I don't think in terms of gesture or structure or composition or color, or as if they are separated things like on a keyboard of a piano or something, you know. I have a need to operate, to act, because there is something that I maybe not like, where I disagree, or either in my work or outside my studio, and I design in my head a certain operative first impulse. And that is starting to then get its first moment, and that generates the next information, and that will generate the next move, and that generates the next move. And within all of these, this sequential, kaleidoscopic movement operation as an acting person.
Yes.
Sometimes it helps me to have something like a canvas where I do it on, or I do it outside, or I do it on a wall, or I do it in a situation that is given.
Fantastic. So I'm conscious that some of our audience will want to ask questions, if that's all right with you. So I just wanted to ask you one more, and it's a really difficult question. Don't say that. And it's a kind of peculiar question. I wonder how you hope people will feel when they come to this exhibition. You know, what they will think, or the thoughts that will pass through them, the emotions they will encounter, the sort of physical sensations or the sensory experiences they will have.
Yeah, I have no specific aim, you know. But this show is so unique. It gives you an entry to all the different perspectives that I'm fascinated in my work, that I'm fascinated by and that I'm exploring. And you will see also a survey here. So you have, according to where your state of interest in painting is, you have a lot of different chances to enter the work here. And at the same time, I hope to shift people's expectations in a way by the encounter of the work, by the directness of it, by the urgency of it, to all of a sudden maybe awake their intelligence, get another understanding of the transformation one can go throughout all the different works. And, you know, so you can read it on very many different levels. I have no specific aim at all.
So perhaps it's a kind of an alertness or a kind of enlarging of ourselves when we come into here.
Yeah, and also how an alternative can be found by looking at something, going away from a certain conventional understanding of what a painting has to be. But it can be, and also I think I'm hoping for loving a certain freedom, which means also a responsibility to connect all these paintings with one another, to find out what is interesting for you, to find out whether you find something at all, for example, to enjoy that process.